There is a sound that survived in Japan for 250 years without ever being written down. It's not a song exactly, not quite a prayer either, somewhere between the two, passed from a father to his son, in the dark, in a language that had already started to forget itself. I came here because of a rumor that on a scatter of islands off the western edge of Japan, there are still a handful of families keeping a secret their ancestors were tortured and killed for keeping. A secret hidden so well, so completely, that when it was finally allowed into the light, some of the people who found it couldn't recognize what they were looking at. This is the story of the Kakure Kirishitan, Japan's hidden Christians, and it starts, like most secrets do, with someone getting caught. In 1549, a Jesuit missionary named Francis Xavier stepped onto Japanese soil for the first time. Within decades, hundreds of thousands of Japanese people, from farmers to feudal lords, had converted to Christianity. Nagasaki, in particular, became something almost unimaginable for the time, a genuinely Christian city with churches instead of temples along its main streets. Then, in the span of about 50 years, the entire government turned against them. The shoguns had watched European powers colonize other parts of Asia, church first, soldier second. So in the early 1600s, Christianity was banned outright. Practicing it was made punishable by death. Foreign priests were expelled or executed, and to root out anyone still hiding their faith, officials developed something almost diabolical in its simplicity. It was called Fumi-e, a bronze image of Christ or the Virgin Mary, laid on the floor. Every villager, every year, required to step on it, publicly, in front of their neighbors, to prove they were not Christian. Most people stepped on it, and meant nothing by it. That was the loophole entire communities would build their survival around for the next 250 years. Because stepping on an image is not the same as unbelieving what's in your heart, and if no one can see your heart, you can keep whatever you want inside it. This is where the story goes quiet for 2.5 centuries. Not silent, quiet. Because somewhere in these hills, on these islands, families decided that rather than abandon what they believed, they would simply stop letting anyone see it. What happened next is, I think, one of the most quietly extraordinary acts of cultural improvisation in human history. With no priests, no churches, no Bibles, and no way to be caught owning anything that looked Christian, these communities had to reinvent their entire faith from memory, disguised as something else entirely. Look at this. To any inspector walking through a village 300 years ago, this is simply Kannon, the Buddhist bodhisattva of mercy, cradling a child, utterly unremarkable, a statue like thousands of others across Japan. But in secret Christian households, this exact image had another name, Maria Kannon, the Virgin Mary, hiding in plain sight inside a goddess whose meaning, mercy, motherhood, compassion, was close enough that no one thought to look twice. It's such a small substitution, and it's also one of the most quietly rebellious ideas I've ever encountered, that if the world will not let your God exist, you simply teach him to wear someone else's face.
The household altar, the butsudan, that every Japanese family was required to maintain to prove Buddhist loyalty. Hidden Christian families kept one too, because refusing to would be suspicious. But inside, tucked behind ordinary Buddhist objects, some families hid something else. A small compartment, a scroll, a cross made of 2 pieces of wood, disguised as household clutter, easily explained away, quietly meaning everything. And then there's the sound I mentioned at the start. Without priests, without written scripture they could safely keep, these communities had to preserve their prayers the only way left to them, by memorizing them, generation after generation, purely through sound. They're called oratio, a word that comes from the Latin oratio, meaning prayer. Passed down by ear for 250 years, with no one left alive who could correct pronunciation against an original text. By the time these prayers were rediscovered by outsiders in the 20th century, linguists realized something remarkable and a little heartbreaking. The Latin and Portuguese words were still there, but the meaning had drifted. Sounds had shifted generation to generation, the way a whispered message changes by the time it reaches the last person in a long line of listeners. Some hidden Christian communities were still faithfully chanting prayers that had, over centuries, become almost unrecognizable, even to modern Catholic priests, as the words their ancestors first learned. They hadn't forgotten their faith. They had preserved it so carefully in such total isolation that it had quietly evolved into something new. Not quite the Christianity that arrived in the 1500s, not fully anything else either. Something that only existed because it had to hide.
In 1865, the ban on Christianity was finally, quietly, no longer enforced. A French Catholic priest built a small church in Nagasaki for the tiny number of foreign residents legally allowed to worship there. He did not expect what happened next. A group of villagers from a nearby community approached him. One woman reportedly whispered to him, in words that have become one of the most quoted lines in Japanese Christian history, that her heart was the same as his. For the priest, it was a miracle, a hidden Christian community, unbroken after 250 years underground. But here is the part of the story most documentaries stop before reaching. When missionaries reconnected with these hidden communities and offered to bring them back into the official Catholic Church, something unexpected happened. Some families said yes. Many others said no. For some communities, what they had preserved for 250 years wasn't a placeholder waiting to be corrected. It was their faith now. The Maria Connon statues, the drifted prayers, the rituals built around secrecy and ancestor memory, this had become its own tradition, tied not just to Christ, but to the specific ancestors who had suffered and died to protect it. To simply discard it and adopt correct Catholicism would have meant, in a very real sense, abandoning their own grandparents' sacrifice a second time. So a portion of the hidden Christians never rejoined the church at all. They're called today the Kakure Kirishitan, the separated Christians, and in a handful of villages on the Goto Islands and the Sotome coast, their descendants still practice this uniquely evolved 3 centuries-old faith. Not Catholic, not quite anything else on earth. Estimates of how many families still maintain the tradition, even today, are difficult to pin down, partly because, after 250 years of secrecy, some families still choose not to discuss it publicly at all. The instinct to hide outlived the danger that created it. In 2018, UNESCO recognized 12 sites across Nagasaki and the Amakusa region as a World Heritage Site, officially preserving the physical history of the hidden Christians. Small churches on remote islands, villages you can only reach by a ferry that runs a few times a day. But UNESCO plaques don't tell you the part that matters most, because the actual secret was never a building. It was never a statue either. Those are just the objects that survived. The real secret was a method. How do you keep something alive for 10 generations when you can never once say it out loud where the wrong person might hear? And on a few of these islands, in a handful of homes that most travel guides never mention, some families are still deciding, quietly, generation to generation, whether to keep going. Some of the last practitioners of the Kakure Kirishitan tradition are now in their 80s and 90s. Their children often have moved to Nagasaki City or Tokyo for work and have not learned the orasho by heart the way their parents did, not out of disrespect, simply because the world that made this kind of secrecy necessary and meaningful no longer exists in the same way. Which means the sound I described at the start of this film, the prayer that survived 250 years of persecution by hiding inside a Buddhist chant, may be one of the last generations to be heard at all, not because anyone is trying to erase it this time. Just because when the reason to hide finally disappeared, the reason to keep passing it on quietly disappeared with it. I don't think this is a story about Christianity, really, or even about Japan specifically. I think it's a story about what people are willing to carry, quietly, for longer than any single lifetime, and what happens to a secret once it no longer has to be one. Somewhere on those islands tonight, in a house with no cross on the door, someone may still be practicing a 250-year-old prayer that the rest of the world has never heard. Whether anyone learns it after them, that part hasn't been decided yet.